In the first chapter of this series on the Unification Church Clerics, we saw that Reverend Sun Myung Moon was following God's providential timetable to advance his Messianic mission. But Lucifer-like clerics played an essential part in derailing God's providence when they connived and conspired against Reverend Moon by 1. Refusing to accept the end of the church-era mandate and the dismantling of the Unification Church. 2. Rejecting Reverend Moon's lineal succession plan and his recognition of Dr. Moon as fourth Adam, and 3. Rejecting Reverend Moon's direction that all movement leaders and entities are under the authority of his son, who represents the era of the fourth Adam. The clerics manufactured theological justifications to provide a semblance of legitimacy to their actions as they seized control of the unification movement. To undermine Adamic authority, they deviously manipulated Reverend Moon's core teachings and the divine principle, which center his messianic mission, on the establishment of a God-centered true family. Their manipulation of those core teachings effectively made them the instruments of Satan, as they outright rejected the central pillar of God's providence of restoration. In this chapter, we will look at the four main theological underpinnings the clerics promoted for their unprincipled agenda. 1. The notion of the divinity of the true parents. 2. The assertion of the co-equal status of Reverend Moon and Mrs. Hak Ja-han. 3. The three-son succession framework. And 4. The claim that all members are the fourth Adam in their own right. The clerics include church leaders, from both the first and the 1.5 generation, who prioritized political agendas and personal gains over providential priorities. Key clerics included Peter Kim, Dong Moon Ju, Chang Shik Yang, Junho Suk, Sun Jo Huang, Ki Hoon Kim, Jung Okyu, Hyunong Kim, Michael Jenkins, Michael Balcom, Katsumi Otsuka, Eiji Takuno, Motu Furuta, Joshua Yashiro, Yongchan Song, Jung Shikyong, Dong Mo Shin, Wanju McDevitt, Suk Byung Kim, Young Ho Yoon, and others, for which there are too many to mention. Every leader who held a major position during this period is part of the clerics, who did not follow Reverend Moon's end of the church-era mandate and his direction to align with Dr. Moon. As mentioned in the previous chapter of this series, with the inauguration and acknowledgement of Dr. Moon as the fourth Adam, during the late 1990s and early 2000s, Reverend Moon instructed that all leaders under the age of 48 be under Dr. Moon's authority. That was essentially all leaders of the movement, including the names mentioned earlier. It was during this period that certain first and 1.5 generation clerics gained key positions of leadership. Later on, elder first-generation leaders from the 36 blessed couples, like Bo Hee Pak, Jae Suk Lee, and Young Hui Kim were recruited to oppose Dr. Moon and to build perceived legitimacy of the regime in the eyes of members. Reverend Moon made it clear to these clerics that they were appointed to their positions to support Dr. Moon, and that they stood in the position of John the Baptist to his son, with the primary responsibility to educate and witness to the larger membership as to Dr. Moon's identity. Reverend Moon implored them to absolutely unite with and support his son as he embarked on his providential mission, and insisted that each leader promise directly to him that they would honor his directive. However, none of them upheld the promise they made, instead actively working to oppose Dr. Moon, making their betrayal all the more sinister and diabolical in the context of God's providence. Reverend Moon was very serious in settling the issue of lineal succession. The completion of his entire life's work as the third Adam, and the fulfillment of God's providence of restoration, depended on the successful completion of Dr. Moon's mission as the fourth Adam. Many members today find themselves asking, what happened to the unification movement that they joined? What happened to the movement, which Reverend Moon founded, and Dr. Moon built from 1998 to its highest peak in 2008? How have things gone so wrong? What we see now is an unrecognizable, splintered remnant of the movement, in which certain heretical schismatic groups manifest ideas fundamentally counter to what the movement should represent. The centrality and significance of true family is paramount from the perspective of God and His providence. Reverend Moon repeatedly emphasized that the vertical unity of Father and Son, centering on God, is the basis on which God's providence of restoration unfolds. The divine principle also teaches that it is critical for blessed families to unite with their able, true family, to set the condition for restoration of Cain's failures. On this point, Reverend Moon taught that
a person in Cain's position must not fail to unite with true parents and true children, who are in Abel's position. By doing so, you can receive the benefits as restored children. In this way, you pass through the path to participate in the position of true children.
Reverend Moon also told the 36, 72, and 124 blessed couples,
because you were born as children of the Archangel, in order for you to return to the position of becoming a son, you have to first be in the position of adoptive children, and attend to my direct son as your elder brother. You must attend to my direct son as your elder brother.
However, like Lucifer, the first and 1.5 generation clerics arrogantly could not accept the providential expectation to subordinate themselves to Dr. Moon, who they deemed to be younger and less experienced than them. They perceived through their fallen human eyes that they were more deserving than Dr. Moon was. They determined that the true family presented a significant obstacle to their agenda to promote a church institution that they control. Here are a few glaring examples that expose how the clerics fundamentally denied Reverend Moon's teaching and direction about the importance of the true family. The most notable example is Hyoyul Peter Kim, who was tasked by Reverend Moon to be the legal guardian of his children when they were young and oversee their upbringing. He knew, more than anyone else, Reverend Moon's wishes, and the divine principles teaching on the centrality of the true family in relation to blessed families, who are in the position of adopted children. Yet among the clerics, Peter Kim championed the path to challenging the principled view of the vertical axial line of God, true parents, true family, and subverted it with the satanic version of God, true parents, church leaders. At a leaders' conference in 2010, Peter Kim declared,
"Our vertical axial line is not to true children, but always to true parents."
Another outrageous example is Chung Shik-yang, who was the Continental Director of North America and a major leader in church organizations. Because of his position, he was able to influence leaders and members, as he promoted that same satanic viewpoint. He even openly used the example of the Nation of Islam to justify his call for an apostolic model of succession, rather than the lineal model that Reverend Moon and the divine principle teaches. The clerics were diametrically opposed to God's providence and the core teachings of the person they professed to be the Messiah. The problem, however, was that they had to deal with Dr. Moon. Realizing Dr. Moon's unyielding commitment, exceptional abilities, and moral authority, the clerics understood that he was a force to be reckoned with, and that they could not manipulate or lie their way around him, as they had with the aging Reverend Moon. The clerics developed a strategy to solidify their own authority and diminish the role of Dr. Moon as the lineal successor. Agenda-driven, they promoted deceptive and unprincipled concepts, that sounded benign to unsuspecting members, but were intended to undermine Adamic authority. The first such concept is the divinity of true parents. The clerics deified the true parents for two reasons: first, to give merit to insignificant comments and remarks by Reverend Moon, and, second, to elevate Mrs. Han by emphasizing the divinity of the true parents. The divinization of the true parents made it possible for the clerics to claim that all of Reverend Moon's words were absolute, without distinguishing his actual providential mandates from merely mundane utterances about daily affairs. The clerics wanted to eliminate all distinction between Reverend Moon's principled words, which were absolute and consequential, and his comments that dealt with the internal politicking of the Unification Church, which they could manipulate and manufacture, and which were of no providential consequence. By giving equal weight to both types of commentary, the clerics could generate confusion, which they used to great effect. But there was a more nefarious aspect to it. The clerics were not just divinizing Reverend Moon, but instead they applied the concept of divinity to both of the true parents. Thereby they elevated Mrs. Han, someone who was 23 years younger than Reverend Moon, and who the clerics knew was not united with Reverend Moon, to a status equal to his. As we will see, in this process they not only undermined Reverend Moon's Adamic authority, but also that of the successor, and fourth Adam, Dr. Moon. To deify the true parents, the clerics promoted the idea that true parents were infallible, all-knowing, and having godlike status. Claiming true parents to be divine served their agenda, since the clerics would be the intermediaries who convey the true parents' words to the members. The following is an example of the language the clerics used to give the true parents a godlike status. Taekyong-oh, one of the Unification Church theologians who espoused this anti-principle theological framework, said,
For the first time in history, a substantial Holy Trinity has been completed. First, the substantial figure is omnipresent. The true parents in the United States can simultaneously be in the Central Training Center in Korea educating us, while on Earth they can also work in the spirit world. Second, the substantial being is omniscient and omnipotent. The true parents can know anything they want to know.
But Reverend Moon deconstructed the framework of a deified Messianic figure in the Divine Principle Black Book. The Divine Principle clarifies that the Messianic figure is human, not divine. It says,
God created human beings with the aspects of both spirit and flesh, intending for them to rule over the two worlds in fulfillment of his blessings. As at the first advent, the Messiah must come as a human being and grow to perfection in both spirit and flesh. Then, by engrafting all humanity with himself both spiritually and physically, he is to guide them to perfection both in spirit and flesh, and make them qualified to be the lords of both the spiritual and physical worlds. While on earth, Jesus was a man, no different from any of us, except for the fact that he was without the original sin.
Apart from the Divine Principle, Reverend Moon's teachings on the Messiah also reveal how false the claim of the deification of true parents really is. He said,
Some say that the Messiah is God, and God is the Messiah. This is wrong.
The notion of divinized true parents was one component in the theological framework the clerics advanced to further their agenda to undermine true Adamic authority and cement their own apostolic succession within a church. Importantly, they used this divinized framework to advance the co-equal status of the true parents. The cabal comprised of Mrs. Han, clerics, and Dr. Moon's siblings, advanced the notion of the true parents, who were of co-equal status, as a way to elevate Mrs. Han's standing to that of an equal to Reverend Moon. Their claim was that she was completely united with him. By propping her up with false claims of total unity, the cabal sought to dilute and undermine Reverend Moon's and Dr. Moon's Adamic authority. This measure became increasingly necessary, because the truth was that Mrs. Han was not united with Reverend Moon at all. First, Reverend Moon and Mrs. Han could not be equal. According to the principle, the Adamic figure is under the direct dominion of God, since he is the elder son in God's direct lineage, with no connection to the human fall. The bride that he must choose comes from the fallen lineage of Adam and Eve, and must be restored and recreated through the Adamic figure. In relation to Mrs. Han, who stands in the position of Eve, Reverend Moon said,
The Messiah is a man. A man. Then what is the woman? The woman was made through Adam and modeled after Adam. It means that she was created because of Adam. So, the Messiah must come to this fallen world and find Eve there. Eve, who was taken away by Satan.
Second, Reverend Moon had his portion of responsibility within God's providence, as an Adamic figure, and Mrs. Han had her own role and responsibility to fulfill, as a woman of fallen lineage, chosen by the third Adam. As Reverend Moon emphasized, Mrs. Han's providential mission and responsibility were to absolutely unite with him. From a principal point of view, Reverend Moon's responsibility was to recreate Mrs. Han, that is, the Adamic figure has to recreate a woman in the position of restored Eve, and her human portion of responsibility is to absolutely unite with him. That was the role that Mrs. Han had to fulfill in God's plan of restoration, to restore the failure of Eve. In terms of his and Mrs. Han's position and their respective human portion of responsibility, Reverend Moon said,
Then, when looking at the principle of recreation, how should the woman be restored? She must be recreated through Adam.
Rather than being co-equal, Reverend Moon explained that Mrs. Han's rightful role and position was to be one of a wife and mother, who supported the Adamic figures in the providence of restoration. He said,
I'm saying this for mother. We have entered the age of cooperation between father and son. Therefore, although she had not cooperated in this, mother can receive all the blessings that are the fruit of women having paid indemnity throughout history, just by maintaining the standard of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience.
Nothing in the principle supports the clerics' claim that Reverend Moon and Mrs. Han are co-equal. Reverend Moon clearly explained his position in relation to hers. He said,
Mother should follow father. For mother, everything works out if she absolutely unites with father. This is because the fall occurred when Eve reversed dominion on Adam. To restore this, Eve must completely obey Adam. The period of restoration through indemnity was the age of mother and son cooperation. The era of Chon-il-guk from now on is the age of father and son cooperation. Mother's opinion is irrelevant. Father's opinion is absolute. Do you understand? Is mother above father or under father? Kwok Chung-hwan. She is under father. That's how it is. From now on, the era of Chon-il-guk is the age of father and son cooperation. Mother's opinion is irrelevant. Father's word is absolute. Do you understand?
It is clear that Reverend Moon understood the age of Chon-il-guk to be represented by the age of father and son cooperation. To him, it is an age in which the third and fourth Adam work in unity, to fulfill the Messianic mission, to restore the failures of Adam's family across 2 generations, and thereby usher in a new age after the coming of heaven, ultimately fulfilling God's dream of creating a world of one family under God. Not only was Mrs. Han not equal to Reverend Moon, the sad truth is that she was not united with him. She had her own agenda contrary to that of God's providence, as we have seen in the second video of these series on the OBD cult. In the final years of his life, an irate Reverend Moon repeatedly made statements regarding Mrs. Han's lack of unity with him. It is astonishing that she claims her lineage was superior to his, that she restored him, that he became Messiah by virtue of her, that she claimed nobody educated her on the principle, and that she is the female manifestation of God's divinity. From 2009 until his passing, Reverend Moon continuously chastised, rebuked, and scolded Mrs. Han for not uniting with him, and leveled judgment at the clerics for enabling her by opportunistically goading her down this treacherous path of disunity with her husband. On July 12, 2009, Reverend Moon rebuked Mrs. Han for disobeying and doing as she pleases. The very next day, again he said,
There is no mother. I have to remake Mother.
On January 24, 2009, Reverend Moon reportedly said,
Mother thinks that she can do whatever she wants. She says, I will go my way, and told me you can go your own way. Things were so serious in the morning. She wants to do as she pleases.
And at a Hundak gathering on January 19, 2012, Reverend Moon once again stated that Mrs. Han was going her own way, and that if she continued like that, everything would be destroyed. He lamented that his wife was not uniting with him. He told Clerics that anyone following Mother is a demon. And he told his wife,
do not brag about your hometown and the Han family name. If you do that, you cannot be true Mother. For Mother to say, don't listen to Father, listen to me, is worse than Lucifer.
As we saw in the second video of this series on the only begotten daughter, less than 2 months before passing away, at a public event in front of 10,000 people gathered, Reverend Moon said that
어머님을 내가 길러와서요. 어머니 없습니다. 문총재 아내 자리도 없어요. 제멋대로야, 제멋대로.
It is clear that Reverend Moon was extremely frustrated with the situation Mrs. Han and the Clerics put him in. Mrs. Han's rebellious acts were getting so out of hand, that Reverend Moon even made Peter Kim and other clerics perform a ceremony, in which they pledged absolute unity with him. But the clerics did not listen to Reverend Moon, instead they made every effort to hide Mrs. Han's disunity and disobedience towards Reverend Moon, as well as their own, from the members. If true parents were not united, the clerics' claim of a deified true parents as objects of worship for their church, would fall apart. To displace Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon's authority as Adamic figures, they needed to continue building up Mrs. Han as co-equal to her husband. So the clerics repeated the lie, that true parents were totally united. For example, in the false spirit world message the clerics presented at Soksho in March of 2009, it read,
Therefore from hereafter, before Heavenly Father and true Mother stand with equal status.
Unification Church theologian, Taekyoung-oh, promoted the notion of absolute unity, saying,
True Mother has become one with God and true Father in the Holy Trinity. Therefore, true Mother's instructions, commands, decisions, and words are the instructions, commands, decisions, and words of God and true Father. Hence, all blessed families in the Unification Church must absolutely obey true Mother's instructions, commands, decisions, and words.
Jae Sok Lee, former Unification Church president, told Japanese members,
True parents have become one in mind, body, thought, harmony, and core. The status of true mother is in unity with true father, and by becoming true parents, they become the eternal object of faith in our church. Believing in this fact is the core of the Unification Church faith.
By claiming that Mrs. Han was completely united with her husband, the clerics not only ignored Reverend Moon's rebuke of his wife, but also disregarded the crucial component of Mrs. Han's own human responsibility in the process of restoration. This is especially important since Reverend Moon taught that only a woman standing in the position of the wife of an Adamic figure has the possibility and responsibility to restore the failure of Eve. Neither her husband, nor God, can fulfill that 5% portion of responsibility for her. Only she can do it. And the necessary condition for that, as Reverend Moon explained many times, is for her to be absolutely united with her husband. By simply claiming that Mrs. Han fulfilled her responsibility, the clerics also disregarded the God-given gift to co-create. And this is the reason that Reverend Moon repeatedly emphasized that his wife does not know principle and said she has to unite with him. If she did, she could stand in the position of a victorious true mother, who set the historical precedent of the proper order in the relationship between man and woman, centering on God. The clerics' claim of the co-equal status of the true parents was a politically motivated calculation to maintain control after Reverend Moon passed away. With Mrs. Han in power, she could run the movement as the other half of the true parents, and dislodge Reverend Moon's lineal succession plan. It was a callous, satanic violation of the principle and God's providence that planted the seeds to destroy true family. Under Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon's leadership, the notion of a godlike true parents was unthinkable. Yet, the clerics actively and openly pushed divinization and co-equal status as key concepts to justify the schism. If they could establish Mrs. Han as divine and worthy of worship, there would be an ongoing need for a church institution. It comes down to a stark dichotomy. Reverend Moon declared that uplifting the ideal of the true family, by becoming its extended members and co-creators of God's kingdom of heaven, requires no church institution, whereas Mrs. Han, empowered by the clerics, claims that the church institution, with mere believers, is of primary importance. As we saw in the previous chapter, when Reverend Moon recognized his son, Dr. Moon, as the fourth Adam, he explained the significance of establishing two generations, centered on God representing the three kingships. For Reverend Moon, it was a momentous occasion in providential history, because he could finally work together in father and son cooperation, to undertake the Messianic mission of restoring the failure of Adam's family, and bringing humanity into God's grace and direct dominion. Both the era of father and son cooperation, and the establishment of the three kingships, were centered on elder sonship. Not three sons, but one son who represents the God-centered family. In the true family, that one son is Dr. Moon. Reverend Moon told leaders and true family members that, on earth, you must unite centering on Hyun Jin. The clerics correctly understood that Dr. Moon had unyielding resolve, and that he would continue advancing, regardless of their opposition. To bring down Dr. Moon, the clerics formed a cabal that included Mrs. Han and Dr. Moon's siblings, whose interests aligned with theirs. Dr. Moon's siblings, especially Sean, Kook Jin, and In Jin, coveted the growing foundation of the Unification movement under Dr. Moon, and had ambition to become leaders in the movement themselves. The clerics seized upon that ambition and took advantage of them, treating them as useful idiots. The purpose of the Three Sons framework was to undermine Dr. Moon's Adamic authority, and create a separation of power among three sons, to eventually eliminate Dr. Moon. Utilizing their intermediary role, the clerics were instrumental in promoting and propagating an agenda-driven perception of three sons leading the movement, as if it had been the true parents' design. This was important to the cabal, because once they had established such a public perception, they could more readily force Reverend Moon to tacitly go along with it. The Three Sons model is not supported by any of Reverend Moon's teachings, yet from 2005, the clerics spread it as true parents' gospel, with Mrs. Han's full support. Sean was the puppet who championed those concepts. He curried favor with Mrs. Han, by being the staunchest supporter of her divinization from the onset, and had been officially promoting her divinity since becoming Family Federation International President in 2008. On June 3, 2011, as its international president, which he renamed to Unification Church in lockstep with the cleric's desire, Sean said,
"The true mother who transcends being human was revealed. Let's send our heartfelt applause to True Mother."
The clerics and Mrs. Han maneuvered to position Sean as the head of religious affairs, and Kook Jin as being in charge of all the businesses. Underneath it all, the cabal had no intention to honor Reverend Moon's plan of lineal succession, or his directive to unite with Dr. Moon. Unbeknownst to Reverend Moon, his plan was actually being systematically undermined. This was only possible with the patronage of Mrs. Han, whom they had positioned as being co-equal to Reverend Moon. The Three Sons model was solely a mechanism to subvert lineal succession, and the providential significance of Dr. Moon as fourth Adam. It was preposterous that the cabal dared to use the three-son succession framework to undermine Dr. Moon's authority, and then had the audacity to further diminish his influence by absurdly claiming that all blessed families were fourth Adams. They did so, even though Reverend Moon specifically explained the significance of that position, and acknowledged Dr. Moon as fourth Adam at his inauguration in 1998, and urged the top leaders to bear witness to the members and world at large. As we saw in the past video, Reverend Moon recognized his son as an Adamic figure, in no uncertain terms. He said,
"We must understand how miraculous it is that the era of the fourth Adam has just started. Finally, from God's point of view, 3 generations have been restored, and now the era of the fourth Adam can begin. That is the significance of this inauguration today. You can receive the era of the fourth Adam through Hyunjin's family."
Central to the Messianic mission of restoring Adam's family is the proper relationship of father and son, manifested in the foundation established by, and cooperation between, the third and fourth Adams. Reverend Moon wanted to pass the baton to his son. But the Bible warns that in the last days there will be those who spread lies. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear, and perform great signs and wonders, to deceive. Instead of following Reverend Moon's instructions, and fulfilling their portion of responsibility, the clerics suggested that all the blessed families, who are in the position of adopted sons and daughters, are all fourth Adams. This was not only a satanic rejection of the fourth Adam, and an obstruction to God's providence, but was also an attempt to distort members' understanding of the principle. Former Family Federation President, Sun Jo Hwang told members,
"The 40-day ideal family training and registration in Jardim has been the course to create fourth Adams. The most important guidance from true parents that was taught during this workshop was that we must become fourth Adams and live a life of faith on our own 2 legs. In other words, we have the kind of faith to become messiahs."
Hwang's position is all the more treacherous, because he was a cleric, whom Reverend Moon personally instructed should unite with Dr. Moon. He expected Hwang to properly teach members on Dr. Moon's position. Reverend Moon specifically told him,
"Sun Jo Hwang cannot be in charge of everything in the future. Since I have children, you should follow my children. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Therefore, Hung Jin works with the archangel from spirit world, and on earth, you must be united centered on Hyunjin. You must unite centered on Hyunjin's family, and through them you can come to parents."
Reverend Moon's statement that blessed family members should aspire to become fourth Adams in their own right, in this era of the realm of the fourth Adam, naturally requires their absolute unity with the actual fourth Adam, Dr. Moon. This condition needs to be met, in order for them to fulfill their providential responsibility as restored Cain, and participate in the fulfillment of the Messianic mission that Dr. Moon was charged with as his extension. It does not mean that they themselves are the fourth Adam, in the absence of, or in lieu of Dr. Moon. But clerics like Hwang twisted and spoke in half-truths the context of Reverend Moon's words, and failed to properly convey the necessity of that foundational unity. Later, the clerics would give a similar interpretation with regards to Reverend Moon's words on the opening and expansion of the blessing ceremony. Betraying Reverend Moon's trust, the Unification Church clerics tenaciously resisted the instructions, given by the person they professed to be the Messiah, of testifying to his son. Instead, they raised false idols as supposed successors, so that God's true Son would not be recognized by members of the movement, and the rest of the world. Their failure not only represents a total failure, in their role as John the Baptist figures, but a complete and satanic betrayal to God, Reverend Moon, Dr. Moon, and to the rest of humanity. The divinization of the true parents, the false notion of co-equal status between Mrs. Han and Reverend Moon, the misleading 3 sons model, and the absurd claim that everyone is fourth Adam, were all strategic manipulations, aimed at securing the clerics' power, and justifying their continued roles within the church institution. These actions not only threatened the integrity of the Unification movement, but also violated God's providence. We have come to understand that the clerics sought to dilute Dr. Moon's own Adamic authority and position as true successor. They used theological justifications to undermine Adamic authority, uproot lineal succession, and ultimately, benefit from apostolic succession, in a church structure they control. And the clerics projected these lies onto the larger Unification church membership, multiplying their sin, to persuade the majority of the movement to participate in it. Members have been lied to, by their own leaders, and were deceived into participating in the greatest providential crime, since the beginning of human history. Reverend Moon's words against the clerics, calling them worse than Lucifer, are a powerful indictment to their betrayal. The Unification movement members must remain vigilant against false prophets, and uphold the true teachings of the divine principle and Reverend Moon, ensuring that the Messianic mission of restoring the human family is carried out with integrity and fidelity to God's providence. In the next and final chapter of this three-part series that deals with the satanic acts that took place to solidify the schism, we will delve into the motives behind the clerics' attack on the true family, and the reason they advanced an apostolic model of succession. We will see how the Unification Church clerics are doing Satan's work to undermine God's providence of salvation and restoration for all of mankind.